An old Chinese saying goes something like, if you only learn from your own will, you'll end up ignorant and isolated. The concepts of cultural diversity, exchange, and mutual learning have never been more important to humanity than today. Nowhere is that truer than in Asia, which accounts for 30% of the world's land area, some 60% of its total population, and is home to most of our oldest civilizations. This is the backdrop for the first ever conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, a week-long event in Beijing that begins on May the 15th. What inspired China to organize it? What role does civilization play in Asia today? I was pleased to be joined in the studio by Professor Wang of Tsinghua University. Professor Wang is not only recognized in China as a leading scholar of Chinese intellectual history and literature, but the U.S. magazine Foreign Policy once ranked him among the top 100 public intellectuals in the world. Professor Wang, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. Earlier in May, President Xi Jinping published an article in the magazine called Qiu Shi, which is a very important theoretical journal for the Communist Party of China. In the article, President Xi made the point that exchanges between different civilizations should be an engine driving the progress of human society and a bond cementing world peace. How do you interpret this central message? Why is this message important at this particular moment?
I guess it's because now we are living in a world full of the chaotic. It's a lot of the chaos and a lot of the conflicts and the contradictions. How to overcome these conflicts, contradictions, it's really need to think about that. Especially some of the scholars or politicians thought that the clash could be happened between the civilizations. So the clash of civilizations became very popular slogan and a theory. So how can, on the one hand, it's a lot of the clash, the conflicts, but on the other hand, we need to find a way to overcome that. So the exchange between the civilizations and to enhance that communication for overcoming the difficulties, I think that one of the reasons, especially in certain regions, that the clash or the conflicts take the forms of the religious conflicts or the so-called cultural conflicts. But what's the real roots of that? Can we overcome it or to find a certain kind of solution through the civilizational conversation exchange is a big issue.
Is that the reason why China is hosting this first ever conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations? What do you think is Asia, first of all, and what's the importance of hosting such a conference to have a dialogue among Asian civilizations?
I think that conference is one of the sequence of the series of dialogues already happened before, last 2 decades. I think that, of course, by scale, it's the biggest one. In the 1990s, already in this region, in Japan, in South Korea, mainland China, Taiwan, as well as South Asian countries, talk a lot about the Asian culture, Asian
but this is the
civilization.
first time that China does this.
Yes. But before that, we already had a lot of discussions for this. And at this time, timing is most important because globalization, on the one hand, developed to the certain level and faced the dangers and the contradictions. How to deal with these kind of the issues. So this is the one reason. The second, I think, the importance of Asian countries as well as many other countries. I mean, the last decades we have developed our dialogue, our communication so much with European countries, America and Japan and so on and so forth, but very little about our neighboring countries in such scale. But last years, this is the first time, large scale, the conference on the civilizational dialogue in Asia. At the same time, before that, we already had the forum the Sino-African Forum, and so on and so forth. I thought that this is a kind of the sequence of that.
What is this meeting trying to find out? I mean, we are highlighting a kind of Asian identity, a kind of Asian consciousness, if I can put it this way. Are we trying to find out the uniqueness that bonds us together, or the difference between us and the non-Asian civilization?
I think that the most important is try to create more equal world, I think, because we live in a hegemonic structure to some extent, unequal structure in the world. So how can we
Would you elaborate a little bit? In what way are we?
Because economically speaking, you have the so-called developed countries, developing countries, and because of the 19th, 20th century colonialism that already created a certain kind of the structure here, and still in Asia, we are facing the challenges as an older legacy like a Cold War. Because we talked so much about the end of the Cold War, well, we can argue that was the end of the Cold War in Europe. But it's difficult to say complete end of the Cold War in Asia. We still face a lot of the conflicts. We know that the Korean Peninsula crisis and the Taiwan Strait, Sino-Japan relations was still a lot of problems. That's old legacies. How to overcome these kind of the legacy, that negative legacies of that Cold War. I think these kind of the dialogue is important.
How is that inequality affecting the way how we look at the world, how we look at ourselves as Asians?
Yes, this is an interesting question. How to define Asia, how to define the Asian civilizations is a big issue. It's not that easy. It's difficult to say the Asian identity based on the sameness of the Asian cultures, because Asia as a concept was the invention of European concept. This is a European idea, and at that time, the Asian can be used for define the identity of Europe to some extent. And now we talk about we Asians, but actually we not only trying to define ourselves in its relation to Europe or America, but trying to see the possibilities, a kind of the one world with the multiplicity. So that's I think the major idea. So in that sense,
would you give an example? A concrete example to see, that we are constantly defining ourselves, using others' criteria.
Sure, of course, all the national identities, it's in its relation to otherness. So in that sense, because basically, from 19th century, 20th century nationalism, for the nation state, the national identity based on that, we try to create the certain kind of the essence, the national essence. That's as the foundation for our cultural identity.
What would be the alternative?
The certain kind of the identity is trying to put it ourselves into much more multiple relations rather than single relations, because that we were in the let's say, especially in the 20th century, we used to identify ourselves in the dichotomy of the China and the West. Not only China, but many countries, India, Japan, Iran, or other areas, they used to define themselves in the dichotomy of the we and the West. But now we try to shift. It's not exclude the West by trying to have a much more rich and multiple relations. So develop the dialogues between China and India, China and Japan, or other ways, so much more rich and multiple the relations to define ourselves. So it's not single identity. It's not a single identity.
So that is a very big misconception. I don't know whether you agree or not. When people talking about an Asian identity, they use a singular term, meaning that there is one uniqueness, there is one thing that is called Asian identity, whereas Asian identity is by nature multifaceted. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, right. Because basically, philosophically speaking, these kind of the identity by nature is multiple. That when we talk about the Asian identity, it means that the multiple identities in the whole region, because we know that the Asian country the Asian civilizations, so many is the origins of different kind of the religions, different cultures and the linguistics and so on and so forth. So it's difficult to define it in a single way. But on the other hand, historically speaking, I think especially in the 19th, 20th century or after the 18th century, that kind of the historical developments in the global history, those regions to some extent subordinated to the dominant powers. So in that sense, we need to change that position.
Well, most recently, a U.S. State Department official, namely Ms. Karen Skinner, who is head of the policy planning under the Trump administration, talked about China being the first great power competitor that is not Caucasian. She cited the political scientist Samuel Huntington's clash of civilizations. So is that what we are talking about here when we are talking about a rising Asian consciousness? Is there going to be more a clash of civilizations between the Asian civilizations and the Western civilizations? How do you see that issue?
I don't see that. From our point of view, obviously it's different. Because as we say that, for example, both Chinese identity or the Chinese culture itself is a very multi-layers, and it's multiple itself, and also linked to other kind of the cultures. And the cultures, it's by nature, it's multiple, as I say. So that's why I use the term of the so-called transsystemic society. I use that term
in a layman's term,
because the system means that you have a different the language, different, even the religions or the ethnicities. However, you belong to the one society. The certain kind of the political culture can hold the difference together. That's a long Chinese history. It shows that.
Yeah. What about the implication of the rising Asian identities to the other identities, to the West, for instance? Is there going to be a challenge? Is there going to be fear of this rising Asian consciousness?
When the Asian consciousness or the Asian identity emerged in the 20th century, that was the slogan against the colonialism. It's not simply against the Western civilization. It's really against the colonialism, imperialism, try to find their own identity and achieve the independence of those nations. So we need to do some maybe distinctions between the cultural issue or the civilization issue and the political issue. This is a link together. When we think about the we Asians, for example, the we Asians, that the issue was not simply used against the Western civilization. It's against the imperialistic colonial hegemony, the dominance. So in that sense, we think about that. By nature, that idea was content, kind of the demand for the equality.
So as individuals, what can we do? What can one Asian, for instance, start doing, changing him or herself watching this?
I think that for me, as a scholar, we need to develop our own knowledge. Because basically we learn so much from the Western social sciences, humanities. So we continue to learn from that. But on the other hand, the cultural communication with different cultures in this region are so limited.
Of ourselves.
It's not only about others. I mean, not about those culture like Indian culture, Japanese culture, Korean culture, but it's these knowledge, the shortage of this knowledge about our regions, eventually became it's a one-sidedness of our self-identity. If we continue to only identify ourselves in a dichotomy between China and the West, the self-identity itself is partial. So in that sense, we need to do a lot of things to change that.
Big topic, but time is really limited. Thank you so much, Professor Wang.
Thank you.
fascinating topic. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.